It's my pleasure then to introduce Dr. Richard Green from Stewart Observatory at the University of Arizona. Richard has held many leadership positions, both at the Kitt Peak National Observatory and the University of Arizona. And his interests range from quasars and black holes to the preservation of dark and quiet skies. In fact, his skills are so widely recognized, so much so that if the word on the street is correct, other institutions do try to lure him away from Arizona from time to time. Fortunately, without success so far. And I presume it will be there. Richard was very active in the American Astronomical Society, being a member of the organization and a member of the AAS Committee on Light Pollution by the short title, Light Pollution, Radio Interference, and Space Debris, and currently serves as the co-chair of the policy subgroup of that committee. He doesn't restrict his services, though, to only U.S. organizations. He is a member of the Commission on Astronomical Site Protection of the International Astronomical Union, the worldwide organization representing the professional and amateur community for astronomy. So tonight we'll hear about current efforts from those organizations to mitigate the impact on astronomy from the many clusters of low-orbiting Earth satellites that are currently being deployed, have been, and the torrent of such satellites that is planned for the future. Fighting to save the night sky. Dr. Green?
All right. Well, thank you, Don. I'm really grateful for your invitation because it's a real honor for me to speak to you, since Flagstaff is by far the world-leading success story on keeping skies dark around an actual small city. So let me see if I don't get absolutely conquered by technology here. And can try this. I assume you can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe I'll just stick with that and be happy. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you about a couple of different topics because we are also still working on the ground-based light pollution as well. And since both aspects are really a threat to our access. And so since I'm a professional astronomer, I really have to start with some actual astronomy because I can't resist, right? So I'll note that a world telescope that's coming online in the next couple of years is this wide field survey instrument called the Vera Rubin telescope. It's got an 8.4 meter primary, it's got a 3-degree field of view, and it's going to do really breakthrough studies in cosmology and dissecting our galaxy. And so it is a traditional optical light telescope, and therefore, even though it's in a very good location in north central Chile, it's threatened as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about one of its problems to show you why this is such a threat. So you know that Einstein's theory of general relativity says that gravity bends light. So if you look at that nice picture in the middle, that's I even have a cursor. That's a classic gravitational lens. The gravitational potential of all that nearby cluster of galaxies is lensing this very distant galaxy behind and stretching it out into an arc. And so what's not known really at all is how the dark matter, the stuff you can't see, is distributed in the universe along our line of sight. So that's one of the main tasks of this observatory, is to try to decompose this cosmic web of material. And they're going to create a gold sample, a great big statistical sample of galaxy shapes to see how they are stretched by the matter you can't see. So it'll contain about 2.6 billion galaxies that are slightly brighter than 27th magnitude in green light. And so that's really faint if you're an amateur astronomer or even a professional astronomer. And that's going to do this statistical determination of how dark matter is spread around. So how faint is that? Well, for every one photon from one of those faintest galaxies, the natural sky glow makes 100 photons of the same area. So you have to stack up a whole bunch of exposures to not only detect that galaxy, but make a good measurement of its shape. So, for instance, if artificial sky glow increases by 20%, then the exposure time to beat that noise increases by 40%. And so on a 10-year mission of this telescope, you have to add 4 more years just to get to the initial result you thought you were going to get. Well, that's tough slogging. So for those scientifically inclined, here's an intensity trace of a spectrum, of several spectra. And so this is wavelength measured in some lab units. This is deep blue. This is visual. This is deep red. And this is a spectrum from about 50 years ago in a very dark place where the only thing you see is the glow from the natural sky. So that's oxygen. These two features are from oxygen. That's the natural sodium in the atmosphere. Here's a spectrum from Kitt Peak, which has a lot more in it. And so all these little features are from emission line lamps. And that big lump is high pressure sodium. That pinkish glow, which is still fairly compact in spectrum, but still adds noise to that whole range. And here are spectra that Chris will recognize because they're schematics of the emissions of various kinds of lamps. So this one is the low pressure sodium that's slowly being replaced. And it's being replaced largely in your town with narrowband amber, which is a pretty good replacement. It still takes up very little of the rainbow of the spectrum. And in some places where you need some color rendition, this is PC amber, which is filtered. So it has mostly light in the yellow green and not much light in the blue. However, even if they take a low temperature LED that's white light, there's a whole lot of blue light where none was. So that's one of the main threats right now. The blue-green used to be the darkest part of the spectrum when you had low-pressure sodium, when you will have narrowband amber, or starting to have. But the white light LED replacement for high-pressure sodium still puts all this light over the blue and green compared to what we used to have. Okay. All right. So this is a solid-state lighting. It provides genuine threat, just as I said, higher blue content. And what we see nationally and internationally is that they're very energy efficient. So city officials love them. And rather than saying, great, we can do with a whole lot less light and save money, they say, wow, we can get a whole lot more light for the same money. So it's created to an elastic demand for light consumption, meaning cities are lighting themselves up more. On the other hand, there can be genuine benefits because unlike the old discharge lamps, which have a long warm-up period, these go off and on instantaneously, which really helps. They can have good lenses in them that you can focus very precisely. And you can tune the color of their energy output, as we were seeing. So, what's the situation? Well, light pollution is growing globally at a rate of somewhere between 2 and 6% per year. So, even as human activity spreads out and we want to live in the suburbs, Sorry, it's getting closer and closer, even to major observatories. My God. Sorry about that. So, the International Astronomical Union and the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs co-sponsored a workshop and a conference on protecting dark and quiet skies. When we say quiet, that's radio, and I'm not going to talk much more about that tonight. And we presented the results of this study to the Commission on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in February 2022. And we proposed frameworks for both for protection of the night sky from both ground and space. And so the goal was clear. We want to slow, stop, and reverse the rate of increasing artificial sky glow. Here I'm quoting directly, so this was a piece about major observatories. It's also true for any protected dark sky places, including nature preserves and anything else. We want to have the artificial sky glow decreasing on a decade's time scale. So that's the goal of this framework. And we'll note that professional observatories tend to be well below a place where you would consider artificial light as actually interfering with the dark night sky. So you can't, one size does not fit all. You have to look at the condition of each protected place, each swamp, each mountaintop, and make appropriate conditions. So how did we do that? What was the proposal to do that? This was a committee of international people who are crusaders like yourselves, who've been at it for a long time, who are aware of the technical options. And the first thing you do is what you guys have been the leaders in, which is do the right technical thing fixture by fixture. Make sure it's shielded, make sure it's has appropriate illumination level, make sure that the spectrum is what you want. But the new look, which was a fascinating proposal, is that what you really want to do in order to say on a decade's time scale we're decreasing things, there needs to be a regional lighting plan, a master plan saying throughout the zone of protection, we cannot exceed this output limit, and then we have to start backing away from it. So what's the consequence of that? Well, for one thing, if you're serious about that protection, lighting limits have to take priority over development. And that's a radical regional planning approach compared to what is done in many places. We'd probably have to institute something like cap and trade, like they do for energy, so that people could get lighting credits that they could use elsewhere to protect the darkest places. And governments, European-style government is much more top-down, so they could actually impose such regulations if they so desired, because this is kind of a world outlook. But in the U.S., it would sure have to be a built consensus to do that. You know these. You guys are well connected with the IDA, and so these principles are ones that we enunciated to the UN as well, saying, you know, this is the sensible way to design lighting in a sustainable fashion. So how do you do it? And this is Kip Peak looking toward Phoenix, so you know we have a statewide issue. So a lighting master plan requires the steps that you could imagine. First, you have to sample the sky brightness over the region, measure both its level and its trend, and then engage all the local governments to say, you know, here's the ceiling. We don't want to exceed that. And so how do we get there around the site to be protected? A good news story is that LEDs are very amenable to active control. So you can have motion activated roadway lighting for much of the night. Well, after rush hour, you're done and the lights come on when something's moving, and otherwise they don't. And that saves a lot for most of the night. Near zones. start from the assumption of no artificial light at all. And so if you're really wanting to protect a nature preserve or an observatory site, there's really nothing there. And the burden is on the developer or the government to show why there's any need. And so you start with narrowband amber with no color rendition at all if there is some need. And if it's really required for safety, I get an education here as everybody. The mines have to be able to tell the difference between water and blood in the middle of the night for safety reasons. So they need color rendition. There are operations that just require it. Then we go with PC Amber, which has a very good color rendition index. And the other proposal was that the minimum required for safety with only a 20% overhead. So you don't suddenly say, okay, I want a safety margin and my insurer wants a bigger safety margin. It's right where the safety research tells you. So everything's fully shielded by and large, and E0 is the protection zone and E1 is its immediate periphery. And so direction matters a lot. And then these experts said, and by the way, we should measure this in some actual series of physical units that can be calibrated, and that there should be an international repository of everybody's dark sky measurements so that we understand where and when real progress is being made. There is also the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with these acronyms. They actually set an actual physical limit in microcandela per square meter, which can be converted to magnitudes per square arcsecond if you so desire. But however, and so they have certain physical limits. We just noted that for most of the places we care about protecting, the artificial sky glow is considerably lower than those limits that the UN actually adopted. So we have made the point that the artificial light at night, Alan, contribution, has to be a determination locally at each site, because if you said, okay, we'll stay within 260 and the limit, and that site currently measures up at 20, that gives developers a lot of headroom to light up their searchlights. So, it has to be a site by site, location by location activity. And this view, just for interest, that's from the summit of Mount Graham looking almost due west. So Tucson is the light dome on the left and Phoenix is the light dome on the right. And Phoenix is twice as far away with 4 times the population. And so not surprisingly, they're just about equal brightness on the horizon. So that's kind of an interesting physical demonstration. International Astronomical Union has been serious about this for quite a while. It's been 12 years plus since they made the declaration for universal right to starlight. And that extends to cities. I mean, we want to go a step at a time and keep the dark places dark. But the previous graph showed you that, city light domes, even far away, 300 kilometers plus, are still a threat to protected places, both natural places and observatories on mountaintops. And so, we need to have these regional protection zones extend and get the buy-in from the cities as well. And that's why you guys are such an example to everyone that's where it has to start. And so it really requires worldwide education to preserve that sky in the context of sustainability for ground-based. So I am preaching to the choir. I just thought you'd be interested in this international perspective on regional planning in order actually to accomplish it. So shifting gears, in May of 2019, we all woke up as SpaceX launched their first tranche of satellites, And we suddenly realized that their paper plans were actually being made real, and the sky was going to change forever in terms of its appearance and visibility. And so what do we mean by that? Well, how are things going? You know, in the 80s, there were, we can read that, you know, a couple hundred satellites. And just in the last 3 years, the number of active satellites have gone from 2,200 to 6,900. And the vast majority of them are in that blue. They're Starlinks. They're from SpaceX. They are the communications satellite network that's being implemented to give you high bandwidth in remote places, which has great social utility. I'll also note that from 2 ASAT tests and and a collision or so, there's about 41,000 pieces of trackable space junk, about 600,000 flecks of debris down to a centimeter, and that debris distribution is basically flat as you go down almost to microns. And so low Earth orbit is now a crowded place and getting much more crowded. So we are rapidly calling this to the world's attention that it may be of considerable commercial benefit. It may put the U.S. well in the lead, but there are lots of corollaries to suddenly changing from the occasional research or military satellite to a whole sky full of commercial activity. So the atmosphere is impacted by rocket emissions. Satellite reentry burns up, and even though it's a tiny fraction of the bolides that come back into the atmosphere, the amount of alumina, it will go up by orders of magnitude, because that's what spacecraft are typically. And it isn't a trivial amount. If SpaceX builds out their full constellation, they have 30,000 satellites with a 5-year lifetime, which means 20% of it must be replaced every 5 years. So you have 6,000 satellites re-entering and 6,000 launched. That's 500 a month up and down. So it's considerable traffic compared to anything we've been considering. There are sunlight reflections that make both glints, make streaks in your astronomical image, and make diffuse scattering. And then there's always the chance that you have uncontrolled reentry, which makes trouble altogether. And there's an impact on radio as well. So why do we care as astronomers? Well, there's a typical tranche of satellites just after launch. And the sky just won't look the same. Almost everybody who's gone out in the night sky has now had the pleasure of seeing a launch with the entrained vehicles. And before they get up to orbit, they are relatively bright. So both the National Science Foundation, through U.S. consideration of satellite constellations, and the UN have sponsored 2 studies each on this question. And now the question is, what is the action that we need to take? And so for professional astronomers and presumably a potentially large amateur market, we need to find and identify streaks in an automatic way and remove them from the data or mask them from the data. We want industry to make their objects a lot less visible than they now are. There are big issues. There are equity issues. Right now, low Earth orbit's being operated on a first come, first served gold rush kind of basis. And the US and 111 other nations are signatories to a treaty saying there needs to be controlled, equitable access to space. Those are inconsistent. And so there is an IAU center set up at least to talk about the mitigations for astronomy. So there was one group that studied the technical issues. mainly from Rubin. If they can be below 7th magnitude, they at least won't wipe out vast swaths of a Rubin image when a satellite passes by. If altitudes are kept low, they are visible largely in twilight rather than after twilight, so that dark sky astronomy and dark sky observing in the night sky is less impacted. And on the other hand, just when we're getting somewhere, now the desire is to link straight to your cell phone rather than to a broadcast tower. And so that thing was just launched at 64 square meters because they need a lot of antenna to detect your cell uplink and catch all the cells that are below their footprint. So why do we care? Well, what science is impacted? That's, by the way, an intensity map, like a heat map of how many orbits you see at a given time. So there are rare transients that might get blotted out in that streak. I showed you that. Let's map the dark matter problem initially. So we don't know how automatic shape stretching detection works in the vicinity of a really bright streak. There's a lot more traffic in twilight, which is when you search for potentially hazardous asteroids. And so, missing a step on a critical orbit will have consequences. And the wide fields trying to really capture a lot of sky are going to get a streak in every exposure, basically, at full build out. What have we been doing about it? AAS has talked to all these people. I and 3 or 4 of my other colleagues have gone to all those folks to say, we have a problem. We understand that this is a real priority of the USA to have commercial space be a healthy, competitive operation, but you are impacting astronomy and other fields, and so we need some balance. So you can see we've been busy having virtual meetings with a lot of folks. Here's our advocacy position. We're saying that it's impacting observational missions from Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, and NASA. And so if the Department of Commerce has a congressional mission to promote space commerce, then we've got a whole of government problem in mitigating the negative impacts of doing that. Furthermore, there are lots of stages right now. The Outer Space Treaty says that a country is obligated to oversee all stages of activity in space, including operations. And right now, there's no oversight for some parts of missions. So we are proposing that mitigation of these negative impacts be a condition of licensing anything that goes up, and that science agencies play a role in assessing whether the corporate mitigation is good enough. And we also want them to take aggregate effects into account. I mean, we don't want a Kessler syndrome, demolition derby runaway, but it's also true that the more streaks, the worse it is for us. And any collisions that create debris increase scattering into the diffuse night sky that will exceed the ground-based light pollution by quite a bit. So, what's our quarter full glass? You may have read that the FCC just issued a partial license to SpaceX for their Starlink Generation 2. And in doing so, they required the execution of a coordination agreement with the NSF and annual reporting on compliance. So this was our highest priority for advocacy. We talked to the FCC, they listened, and they did this all on their own without Congress forcing them to. So that was wonderful. SpaceX didn't oppose it because they had just voluntarily completed such a coordination agreement signed off by their lawyers and the NSF's lawyers. And so the terms are great. They are making best efforts to get to 7th magnitude in their reflection. They have we can talk about it. They have a fancy mirror coating that gets the reflection off the ground path from the satellite, and they're doing other things. As they're not downlinking over radio telescopes, so they're doing some good things. We asked that Congress make the FCC do that, and Congress was very enthusiastic, but they are trying to remove authority from the FCC and put it elsewhere. So they didn't actually write it into law that they're considering. But the FAA authorizes launches. They very much want aggregate effects to be taken into account because they do have an environmental consideration, and they're not allowed by their authorization at the moment to do that. So they're up for reauthorization this year, and AAS will be knocking on their door. The Office of Space Commerce has been very supportive of us, even though they're probably going to be the gateway for all the commercial activities. They've co-sponsored meetings with the NSF and with the IAU, trying to inform the commercial world that their voluntary compliance will be really helpful. And another aspect is that people like to create, astronomers like to create artificial stars with lasers, but you can't fire a laser if it will interfere with a satellite. And the Department of Defense was protecting every registered satellite, including all the thousands of Starlinks. And so SpaceX voluntarily removed their constellation from that protection list so we can talk lasers again. So what is this IAU Center all about? Its goal is to try to coordinate world efforts to observe satellites for their brightness as a function of phase, to develop the software so we can predict where the satellites are and avoid them, to find streaks and mask them out, and to create a policy framework, including the UN, where advocates for their local countries can go and do good things. And so I'm a co-lead on the Policy Hub, and you can see, we want to codify good intentions of industry by actually turning it into law that they have to do it. And each country has a different approach for what makes them responsive. And so we really want to balance the commercial development with the mitigations required for long-term sustainability. So this is the sky we would like. This is the sky that we're going to be living with for the foreseeable future. And so we're just trying to make those streaks as dark as they can be. So that's my story. Went a little long, for which I apologize, but it's interesting times.
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very interesting. One thing that occurred to me is when you talked about at the early part, when you were talking on more conventional light pollution topic, you talked about trying to establish regional management targets for lighting amounts or sky brightness, and possibly cap and trade or other things, so that when new lighting is added, that somehow the effects of previous lighting had to be addressed to keep the overall condition within acceptable limits. Now, one of the thoughts that I think that you talked about was that might require removing something or not developing something. If somebody has a proposal and it's already at the limit, then maybe there's not any room to add it. But I wanted to point out one thing which I'm sure you're aware of, and that when you mentioned Flagstaff as an example, those adding lights to an existing condition which has largely been developed without any of these common sense strategies for mitigating impacts like shielding or limits on amounts per acre or et cetera. When you're building in that circumstance, there's all kinds of room, all kinds of headroom to make room for more light to be added for new developments simply by bringing the old lighting, retrofitting the old lighting into sensible standards, which can be easily shown to have no impact on the ability of the people who are using the light on the ground to do what they need to do. You're just going to shield it, and that would cut the light pollution, let's say, by half. Or you cut its spectrum to a different portion of the spectrum for roadway or parking lots. Am I coming through all right?
You are. My dog's had an opinion on that.
Oh, okay. Anyway, the Flagstaff measurement compared to Cheyenne, which you might have seen, showed a ratio of more than 10 to 1, even though Cheyenne and Flagstaff are of similar size. We think there's a lot of headroom there for improving the lighting on the ground in the vast majority of communities which have not really got good, up-to-date, state-of-the-art dark sky friendly lighting in their communities.
And I completely agree with that. And the political scientists that we had working, a couple of them working with us, were wrestling. It's the obvious thing to do. The question, the question is forever and always who pays. And those were the policy issues that we were actually trying to think about to implement such a plan. How do you establish the fund for private individuals to do that? And that's part of that cap and trade. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot easier option to offer to somebody to say, rather than you can't develop that, or you have to take somebody else's lights out. Those are both very difficult arguments to make. But instead to say, okay, if you want to add 3 million lumens for this project, you need to mitigate, take 3 million lumens out of the sky from some other project, and that would just be retrofitting lighting, which is a much smaller economic impact on the proponents who wants to do something new. But yeah, they're both, like you say, they're still green money and somebody has to pay.
That's right. And there's also, I think you have to have a don't develop component, because otherwise, the searchlight factory at the base of Kitt Peak it doesn't help, right? So
I agree. That one would rarely come up except in the Astronomical Observatory circumstance, which it has come up in Flagstaff, and I'm sure also in the Tucson area. But for the vast majority of communities for whom Starlight, IAU and AAS are making the argument that Starlight is a right to everybody, not just for observatories, those communities will usually not have to face that hard rock choice.
But fair enough. And, the practical approach we've taken, because there is a very interesting activity, because we had the international and national lighting societies and the national lighting manufacturers actually reaching a consensus with us on this stuff. And so there was broad agreement that you start with the places that are dark, rather than trying to plunge in and make the cities a whole lot darker than they are. Start with protecting the places that you want to keep dark that are dark now, and work in those radial zones outward. And all of them were, in agreement that kind of lighting, that's where you start with the good practices for lighting protection, and others will get the hint when they see that it's safe and attractive, and, you can then push harder into the big metro areas.
Well, it was nice, Richard, to hear that there are glimmers of optimism out there that are being worked and developed as we speak too. But what fraction would you say of the planned satellites are sort of outside of the United States and even the signatories of whatever UN actions are being taken? And what options do we have to bring in those? I won't call them renegade satellites, but I'll call them non-complying satellites, launchers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And
I'm sure you have a great answer.
The key uncertainty is how seriously you regard a plan versus a filing, a statement of intention to do something. And so, the good news is that even the Chinese government stands up in public and says, we see this as a problem and we're going to work to make our constellations also less visible. And so that's good news. There's a registration, and forgive me if I don't remember which African country, to launch 300,000 satellites. And so, against SpaceX's desire for 30,000. So is that serious? It's really hard for us to say.
Well, sounds like a ship registry through Cyprus. In other words, we don't intend to launch them, but we have the slots. They've been approved. Anybody want to come? But you buy our permissions.
That's exactly right. And fortunately, the ITU is a little more serious in that if you don't act on it in a certain amount of time, you don't keep the slots. But that's why, Don, you've got your finger on it. It's a worldwide issue. It's not just a U.S. issue. So because the U.S. company, SpaceX, is well in the lead, we're working hard on U.S. policy, but it has to be a sort of UN consensus that the members ought to all pay attention. Otherwise, you're right. We have a few in compliance who might complain that they're spending extra money, making them less competitive. What I have to say is, what I've learned in all this is that regulation takes just shy of forever. And so, our much more productive approach has been sitting down with each of these companies and saying, here's our need. SpaceX has really been a leader in this. I mean, as annoying as they are, they found this coding that they, for most viewing angles, will cut their visibility by a factor of 50, and they sell it at cost to any other competitor who wishes to have it for their satellites. And, and so they've taken this very seriously, and they're still working on it. They said, we think this will get us down to about 6th magnitude, and we promised you 7th, and we're going to keep going. And they darken their shark fin solar panel, and they do maneuvers to make their craft less visible, and even though slightly non-optimal for power. So they're really taking it seriously. So, we're trying on the one hand to get what they're doing well into a policy and regulatory framework, and on the other hand, we're cheering them on. I mean, they got an ovation at the AAS meeting. A couple of the SpaceX engineers were actually there for the efforts they're making to try to keep this in the box. So in the first instance, we're trying to bring everybody into the tent and say, let's get along. You'll do your business. If you make them a little darker, we won't yell at you so much.
Boy, I wonder if we could get some of the regular on-the-ground lighting manufacturers to come to AAS and say, we no longer sell unshielded fixtures. And they can get a round of applause.
Yeah, I would think even an IDA certification, is good marketing for them. You would think.
Any more questions? Well, that's been a very interesting talk, Richard. And like Don, I want to underscore the fact that we're pleased to see glimmers of hope. There are some things that are working and getting better. The responsiveness of SpaceX is encouraging. That 50-time reduction, that's a 98% absorption effectively. That's remarkable. That is a black satellite, 98%.
No, it's a shiny satellite. It's actually a Bragg mirror, and it is specular reflection, but sends it off the ground track and off into space. They couldn't absorb that much heat. Well, they want to stay cheap, right? So they don't have big thermal management. So they can't soak up the heat. They just have to send it off somewhere.
Right.
I have a question.
Sure.
What is SpaceX doing to mitigate the light pollution? What specifically are they doing?
So they have their down-looking face is a phased array radio antenna. And so that's what they're coating with this mirror-like coating that sends the light back off into space in another. The sunlight goes into space in another direction rather than onto the ground. They've darkened the non-solar panel part of their solar panel so that it's much less visible. And they make maneuvers so that you have, when they actually are going across a ground path, they're less visible because their geometric profile is as small as they can get it. So they do those things on our behalf.
Well, this is the portion. Thank you, Richard. I suppose people are muted. I don't know if they want to applaud, but thank you very much for your time and updates. And further, me as an astronomer who's been in this business for a long time, I appreciate your diligence and perseverance over the decades, working with a very complex and complexifying issue. I mean, the last 5 years have gotten only worse in terms of the different directions that you've had to watch out for. And you've done a great service for astronomy and over the years, and you're continuing to do so, and it's very much appreciated. And for
standing on the shoulders of giants, Chris, and it's all about a team of people who do this. So
yes, yeah, I understand.